Hi everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Llewellyn. I run the services at MedCommsNetworking.com for the global MedComms community. So I'm thinking people who work in and around medical education, medical communications, medical publishing. We're meeting online today during the COVID-19 pandemic, and most of us have been locked down for a few months. Meetings and events activity has been disrupted massively with a rush to go virtual. There's lots of questions about quite how this is going to pan out, but today we wanted to take stock of where we are, share some insights and thoughts about what's happening and what the future might hold. So in this session, I'm delighted to be joined by Len Starnes, who's been closely watching the medical societies and the evolving nature of their congresses for some time now. So he's going to share some of what he's seen recently. We'll have a presentation, we'll follow that with a Q&A session, and our online audience have been invited to send in comments, observations and questions. So over to you, Len. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I hope you can see my screen now.
Yeah, that's fine, yeah.
Okay, great. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Len Starnes. I've been working in digital healthcare for about 25 years, and the future of medical conferences has been a topic that has been of special interest for me for some time. Well, that's enough about me. Now, as we all know, coronavirus has radically disrupted medical conferences, cancelling many, transforming others from physical to virtual events in a matter of just a few months. And medical conferences, I'm sure, will certainly never be the same as they were pre-coronavirus. But the question is just how different will they be? And I think just as importantly, when? So I'm going to try and answer these questions in this very short intro. And I've called it Medical Conferences, Long Live the Medical Conference REDUX, because I first gave a presentation on the digital evolution of medical conferences way back in 2013. Same title, this is the REDUX version. So just to make it absolutely clear, given today's time constraints, I can really only talk about medical societies, and in particular, their international events. But first, a little bit of context, which I think is important. Medical society conferences have been digitally evolving for some time, and I've been tracking this for years, noting continuous change. And it's really been evident in societies becoming increasingly aware of digital channels, creating digital health committees and the like, setting up heads of digital, and the introduction of limited virtual conferencing features. So who was driving this change? Well, no question, doctors, millennial doctors, younger doctors, digitally savvy, who keep up to date using digital channels, of course, and who simply weren't prepared to wait years for what's new in their speciality at the Society's annual meeting. And I think later we'll see Generation Z doctors becoming the new change drivers. What's important for this presentation is to remember, I think, that doctors will remain the prime conference change drivers in the conference work in a coronavirus world. A bit more context. Remember that medical societies are generally characterized, I think, these three attributes. Not all, of course, as a very pronounced innovation adoption distribution, with a significant difference between the innovators at one end and the laggards at the other. And I'm sure many of you know who they are. So here's Virtual Reality 2020. All major societies have transformed their physical conferences in the space of just a few months to virtual, I think perversely contradicting what I said about them being slow. And some, by all accounts, have delivered quite impressive user experiences. So what's the verdict? How good have the first wave of virtual conferences really been? Well, I think it's most important to look at what doctors are saying, those prime change drivers. Now, opinions, of course, vary from region to region and country to country, but generally, I think on the pro side, there's broad agreement that being at home, zero travel, reduced costs, and a pajama retirement are big pluses, especially for doctors from middle and low income countries. And all welcome the benefit of global access. That's raised quite a bit, with some doctors, again from middle to low income countries, talking about leveling the educational playing field as they have access to some of these major international events. And with both live and on-demand access to presentations and discussions, many say the educational experiences is as good as or superior to physical events, something we've read about quite a lot with the experience of some universities have been experimenting with virtual teaching environments. On the con side, inevitably, many doctors complain about intangible losses, the lack of person-to-person contact, opportunities they often afford, to say nothing about having drinks with friends and colleagues in the evening. That said, ASCO 20 featured a global real-time networking platform, one-on-one video calls, running for 3 months until the end of August. And they made a serious attempt to emulate physical conference networking. And then some complaints we've heard are about time zone differences, which are going to be inevitable, of course, and the occasional technical glitches. But from what I can see, virtual conferencing technologies are improving by the hour. So, as I'm sure you all know, ASCO 20 has probably been the most closely observed and discussed virtual event during the last few months. And it's been a great place to gauge opinions, I think, from all sides. So there's a poll from an attendee. She's an oncologist. And can you see what doctors like best? Not being away from home is the biggest plus, 43%. And loungewear, whatever that might be, is seriously popular too. Another Twitter poll, this time posted by Medscape, with a much larger participation, I think is more revealing, as it shows that about 70% of doctors, mostly oncologists again, I am assuming, will not attend ASCO 21 if no vaccine is available. That's nearly 70%. And note too that almost half responded with a categorical no, regardless of vaccine availability. So these results alone should give ASCO serious pause for thought about their planned 2021 physical meeting in Chicago. Now, in another poll, run the UK's largest doctor network, almost 50% of respondents across all specialities stated they prefer to attend virtual conferences during the next 12 months. I mean, taking it through to June 21. And the results here, you can see, are almost identical to the Medscape poll. Now, I sincerely hope medical societies are taking note that only about half of doctors are willing to attend physical conferences next year. And finally, I must thank and give praise to doctors.net as they ran this poll especially for me. So Ria, if you're with us today, a big thanks. So what about the impacts of medical science? Well, if you look at the pro side, I think the first three appear to be identical to those of doctors. The fourth, I've taken from a statement from the ASCO CEO, who claimed that the scientific program of the virtual ASCO 20 was identical to the normal expected scientific program of any of their annual meetings, with really no loss of quality or quantity, which I think is good news. And of course, costs will be lower compared with physical in future, that is. The cons, I think, are truly disruptive for the societies. Obviously, given the exceptional circumstances this year, many face financial losses, but I don't think this will be the case in future. I think quite the opposite, in fact. The other cons really strike at, I think, at the very nature and structure of medical societies. I mean, in future, I think they'll have to become significantly more savvy, digitally nimble. They must listen much more closely to their millennial and in future Generation Z members. And critically, in a virtual or hybrid world, they're going to have to develop new business models. Well, in considering new business models, you must always follow the money. It was interesting to see this extremely candid statement from the ASCO CEO. In an interview, he alluded that in future, virtual or hybrid ASCO meetings would, quote, offer positive financial margins, or in plain speak, make a profit. It appears to me that ASCO is already convinced that there are sound virtual business models out there. So here are the fees demanded from virtual exhibitors this year. Platinum bought you all the benefits. Exhibitors just the basics. Now, I counted about 230 exhibitors at ASCO 2020 virtual. So if you plug in some realistic exhibitor numbers to each category, you can easily arrive at $10 million, yeah, 10 million, which I think is a pretty good start to a virtual or hybrid business model. And it looks as though hybrid formats are what the majority of doctors want in future. One leading European medical society, which chooses to remain anonymous, carried out this survey just recently after their annual virtual event. And as you can see, a whopping 83% of their members prefer hybrid, which I think is pretty convincing. And we talk about transitioning to hybrid conferences as if it was similar to flipping a switch. Yet the reality is that medical societies confront the necessity of managing two kinds of infrastructure, physical and virtual, but running in parallel. And I think for societies more used to physical infrastructures, developing an appropriate complementary virtual infrastructure for their particular conferences will be a huge challenge. And I've listed here a handful of the issues, but the list goes on and on. I mean, just identifying the right vendor and the platform technology is truly a daunting task. Now, I can't leave out a mention of farmers from the discussion because they'll play such a decisive role, I think, in any new business models. Essentially, I think they face a dilemma. Going virtual or hybrid disrupts their established marketing strategies. I mean, for example, farmers in the past often believed that physical conferences, the big international events, can make or break a new drug. But will virtual conferences be able to do the same? I think farmers must develop completely new engagement and content models for virtual environments. It's going to be a tough one. On the other hand, virtual conferences offer the opportunity to cut conference costs. I mean, this is something the industry has been complaining about for years. I mean, one key measure of farmer dissatisfaction has been the continuous reduction of stand space and sponsoring at major conferences over the last decade. I mean, I could say a lot more about this one, time's limited. And I must, of course, add a word about patients as change drivers. They overwhelmingly embrace virtual because it simply offers more opportunity to attend. And many societies now recognize the importance of having patient advocates attend their conferences, either as speakers, panelists, or just participants, because I think they now acknowledge that understanding the patient perspective is really essential. And societies too want to be seen as patient-centric, if we have to use that particular jargon term. So where do we stand today? Well, for the next year, nearly all the major societies are promoting physical events, but they don't provide any details. Why? Because they're not sure if they really take place. I mean, some of the medical societies, and there were quite a few, I contacted during the last few months in preparing for this, have all essentially said the same thing. We're closely monitoring development or something similar. So what can we expect during the next few years? I mean, based on what we now know about doctors' conference preferences, which I think they're evolving, plus all important predicted vaccine and herd immunity timelines, or I think more conveniently, probabilities. So here are my 3 scenarios. this year and next, a vaccine or vaccines are possible in the best case, but I think this is really a euphemism for very, very low probability. And herd immunity is almost impossible, given that 60% of the world population must be vaccinated to achieve this. This requires about 5 billion doses to be manufactured and distributed. So I predict virtual conferences will remain the norm for next year. Come 2022, vaccine or vaccines become more probable, yes, but herd immunity remains unlikely. Again, very low probability. Hence, I predict most conferences remain virtual, but the remainder hybrid. And in 2023, beyond, the probability of having effective vaccines will increase further, but herd immunity timelines remain really unknown. I think hybrid conferences may well dominate, but right now it's impossible to predict with any degree of confidence. And I don't think we should forget there's a real probability that we may never find a vaccine. As Anthony Fauci said just last weekend, we are living in the perfect storm. And on that note, thank you, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Excellent, thanks. I was just letting you flick through those last couple of slides there. Great, excellent, thanks, Len. If we could close those slides, that was great, and it's hopefully quite thought-provoking. One of the things that I find fascinating about all this, and perhaps most frustrating, is the sort of the business model side of it, because it's easy to talk about lots of different ways in which we can do things, but I think the business models are going to be challenged a lot. And people are talking very glibly about doing hybrid meetings and so on at the moment. Or if you're going to do a hybrid meeting, you need enough people to pay to come to the conference in the first place to have a meeting, and then you've got extra costs to do it out, sort of thing, to stream it or whatever. So I think it's very complex, and I know we're very much at the moment not really quite sure how it's all going to work out. But one of the things I'm interested in, and I just wonder what your sense is at the moment. I know you've been watching these conferences for quite a lot, but it sort of impacts on the business model side of it. It's very easy to say, well, we're now going to run either a hybrid or virtual model, and we're going to reach, I don't know, thousands more people than we would have otherwise been able to. And certainly from what I'm seeing, a lot of people are talking about the registrations for a meeting, for instance, at the moment. Not a lot of people are talking about how many people actually turn up. And not a lot of people talk about how many people then actually engage with the meeting. And those are very, very different numbers, aren't they? I just wonder whether you get a sense, and whether you've seen any data from the societies about people actually genuinely engaged with the meetings as opposed to registration numbers. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, Peter. But no, I don't have any data on that. I mean, most of the societies I've contacted, you know, waxing lyrical about the numbers of people who actually attended. And obviously this is the first time. Who
attended or registered.
Yeah, but that no one's, to be honest, most of the societies I contacted are being very, very conservative, very cagey about releasing any information. I mean, I showed you that one survey from the society that remained, or wants to remain anonymous. That was quite an exception. I asked similar questions to probably about 8 or 9 societies. There were only really 3 that were honest. All the rest were very cagey, didn't respond, but certainly were not prepared to share data like that. So registration and actual numbers participating, no, I really don't know.
Yeah. I think, I mean, and you and I first met each other on the sort of the e-pharma conference circuit many years ago. And I just keep thinking about what was happening at that time when everyone was banging on about hit rates and stuff, and it didn't really relate to real people doing real stuff. And now it's a lot about, you know, registrations or people or views on videos and things. And again, it's like, what's that mean in terms of real people and real engagement? As an example, I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I was 2 or 3 weeks ago, I lose track of time. I was formally sort of like committed to 3 different online conferences, 2 of which I paid for. I was also running my own conference. I was also publishing a document that week, and I was at home attending them. So my family had a list of things I had to do at the same time. And several questions have already come in about, it's all very well in principle, but how do we ensure, how do we encourage that engagement? How do we avoid the distractions with all those other things that you find yourself doing? I don't know whether you've got any insights into that. We're going to cover off a lot of questions if we can provide some insights into how we ensure the engagement of people.
No, but it's a comment that's made often, and I experience that myself as well. I know it's quite difficult to do. But those first Twitter polls about people enjoying being at home, being able to attend in loungewear, pajamas, or whatever it is, shows there is some affinity to that. But obviously, you've got a family or whatever, and you've got kids roaming through your office with thousands of other distractions. It's a challenge, for sure.
And sorry, I'm flicking. We have got quite a lot of questions coming in, guys.
Yeah, go on.
So
okay.
bear with us slightly.
Yeah.
Let's just pick up a couple of sort of maybe interesting specific points. So Tessa's saying, what do you mentioned hybrid model? Define what you mean by a hybrid model. Is it possible to define that, or is that just one of those words that's being bandied around at the moment?
Yeah, okay, good question. As I see it, and I think the way that most people understand it, is that there is a physical event. I mean, I assume in future these physical events will be smaller based on doctors' willingness to attend them. But okay, a physical event, and then will be in parallel an opportunity to tap into the presentations live, post questions, interact with speakers, but also, of course, then there will be the opportunity afterwards to look at the presentations, perhaps also interact with the speakers on demand. That will go on for much later. That's what I understand. Maybe there's another interpretation of hybrid, but that's what I understand. What I have heard, and I've spoken to a number of doctors and some people in medical societies about what they think is a hybrid event. If anyone's got another definition, please let us know.
Yeah, let's share some definitions there. And just sort of following that thought a little bit, in terms of making content available and so on. I think Jason's asking about this Congress 365 model. I mean, in fairness, several years ago, you were talking about that, weren't you? The idea that, a conference shouldn't be just 2-3 days or whatever at a venue. It should be sort of all year sort of thing. There's discussions are going on all year. You can see a lot of that starting to happen. I mean, conferences are being stretched out over a week, whereas previously a day or something. And content is being made available for months and maybe beyond. So do you want to just sort of address that question, maybe talk a little bit more, because I remember you talking about this years ago.
Yes, I mean, it's a very important point. I mean, you don't have to take the physical model and just duplicate it in a way. The whole point about virtual is that you don't have to have 1 or 2 days or 3 days of conferencing. You can space it out. We've already had one medical society that have done that. They had, and I can't remember which one it was exactly, but they spaced their conference out over 10 days, and they've made everything available, of course, for the next year or so. So that might well change opinions about what hybrid really means. And certainly it offers great advantages if you can have a conference that can run over days, weeks, months. It makes the learning experience, the teaching experience much easier, and many people like that. The millennials love it.
Just out of interest, you've talked a little bit, several times actually, about millennials and Z generation and all the rest of it. You talked a bit about some of the data that would appear to be showing that doctors want the virtual activity, the hybrid meetings and so on. Have you got any data, any insight into whether that is, age dependent, or any difference in terms of any differences in any of that, or was that just, is that data just sort of, you as a group, we don't know much about you, but what's your overall opinion? Have you split that data out at all?
Well, I haven't looked especially at data recently. I mean, there are many reports about doctors' preferences in using online tools, broken down by speciality. Quite a few sort of syndicated reports on that. When I first started talking about this, it was through my interviews with medical societies such as the European Society of Cardiology, European Cancer Organization, Rheumatology Association, and they all said basically the same thing. Our younger members, the millennials, are no longer loyal to this society. They prefer to get their information continuously via the internet. Only one piece of data that I received, I asked doctors at social networks also in preparing for this presentation. And one network called Colliquia, it's the largest network in Germany, they have carried out a number of surveys over the last month or so asking about whether doctors' opinions about using online resources has changed. I remember German doctors are very, very conservative. Well over, I think it was 83% of the doctors have said they're more inclined to use online resources in future. Which gives you an idea, and that wasn't broken down by age group, but it was across the board. And this was a survey of almost 190,000 doctors.
Right. I mean, one of the things that gets me, or I feel when we're talking about this sort of thing, is it's easy to make simple judgments, you know, like the millennials want to do this and old people like me want to do something else. Whereas I think it's much, much more mixed. And to some extent, it depends on your experience. I mean, one of the things that's happened in the last few months is a whole bunch of people who didn't think some of this stuff was possible have sort of been forced to get involved in it and are now evangelizing about it. And I do think that needs to be understood better. And some of the surveys that have come out in all these areas, you know, surveys in April will be different. Frankly, the results are changing. I think the results, you know, now would be different, and in 6 months' time would be different as people come to terms with it. And there's a real conflict, I think. It was interesting, like in this country, the pubs all went, you know, all opened in England. Was it last weekend or something? And there were people who were there at 7 o'clock in the morning waiting to get back in the pub. But there weren't that many really. And there were more people who were a bit more hesitant and maybe wandered back. And then there's a whole bunch of us who went, actually, I'm just not that worried at the moment. I'll hold back. So again, I come back to business models and the numbers, as it were, because I think, you know, it's easy to talk about this stuff, but people and what they do over the coming months is going to be fascinating. And if pharma companies, for instance, I've heard certainly I've heard some of the people in the audience will know better than me, pharma companies saying, you know, there will be no travel until 2021, sort of 2021. So that's going to have a big impact on your plan, sort of thing. Yeah. But if you're a conference organizer and you've organized a big conference, you might well be committed to funds way in advance. I mean, this stuff is really quite, well, it's disruptive, isn't it? Which is, I guess, what we're all talking about.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have a much clearer picture about what's going to happen in future at the end of the year. If you look to see the conferences that are going to, the society conferences are taking place September, October, November, December. It's quite a few. Some of the big ones, you know, like the ESC and the transactions that are taking place. Those are some of the biggies. And the societies, some of the societies told me, like the ESC said, basically, we don't really know about next year, but we're going to be monitoring our annual ESC conference very closely, and we'll make decisions after that. Yeah, and you know, things may well change.
Exactly, and I think maybe Andrew's asking this question. Maybe he's hinting at what I was sort of thinking. You know, some of these societies, particularly bigger ones, have got big reserves. Yeah, so you know, I'm you know, aware of certainly one industry association who've had cancelled their conference this year, and there'll be maybe one coming up later in the year. And I was slightly surprised when I realised, or we saw how much reserve they had. So they can get through this year, but they're going to take a big hit if they can't figure those business models out. And you know, there must be lots of societies who are much more on the knife edge than that. And you've touched on sort of big international conferences versus little regional meetings and societies and things like that. There must be some big differences in there, and some of them, as I say, must be right on the edge, and some of them using up their reserves. And I think Andrew's saying, do you get a sense that they're successfully transitioning the business model? I guess what we're talking about is we don't know, and they're not really telling us, but they're going to have to think pretty hard about it, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, the ASCO CEO basically said that this year is going to be financially tough, but he did say in a much longer article that they're going to weather it because they took out the appropriate insurance. Now, whether that applies to all medical societies, I'm not sure. Whether that applies to smaller medical societies, I don't know. But having had, you know, if you're taking out the insurance, then okay. And if you then plan for a much more solid and robust business model for next year and beyond, then that looks much, much better.
And again, it's the difference between what's happening this year and you might have insurance or something, and what sort of insurance you're going to get for next year. Sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's going to presumably change things. I'm just trying to, again, I'm sorry, guys, there's a lot of comments coming here. Chris saying that intensive care societies are small and already on the knife edge. Something over here, Dominic saying, I can confirm from the farmer angle, nothing's being done until 2021. It's going to be a real headache for budget planning.
One comment just on the farmers. I did reach out to some farmers again and confirm that all the farmer patient events, many farmers run physical international patient events, they've all shifted to virtual, and they will probably remain so for the foreseeable future. But they're all fairly quiet and do not want to make statements about how they feel, what they think will be appropriate for them in future. I think they're just waiting to see as well.
Is it a slightly flippant comment, but I think I'd say a number of us, I'd count myself in that group, who've argued for years that maybe there's frankly too many conferences, too many events, you know, maybe there's a lot of not so useful stuff as well as the good stuff. Is it reasonable to look at it as just this is going to be the shakeout that some of us have maybe argued that should have happened? And is it okay to assume that maybe the good stuff will survive and the not so good stuff won't? Or do you think that's a hopelessly naive view?
Yeah, well, I mean, there have been countless surveys of attendees at conferences, and they've been a bit contradictory in the past. Some years ago, we saw the doctors saying they would much prefer virtual. The recent one I saw said that doctors, at the end of the day, do prefer physical. I don't know. The biggest comment I've heard or criticism of physical events is just the learning experience. It becomes more and more difficult for doctors actually to follow some of the new findings in their specialty at these large events where they have to run from one conference, one auditorium to another. It's not really conducive to learning. And all the doctors say that the events are too big, they run for too many days, they want them to be shortened. And one major thing that we've looked at is that doctors really want highlights from these conferences. They really would like to know what's really relevant for their practice, and they want to know things that they can put into practice the day after the events. So it's you know, looking much more to see about whether they can focus on the things that are necessary to be better doctors.
And that could all be much more achievable digitally.
Well, and exactly, yeah.
And then for me, as I say, the question for me then is if you're talking about hybrid models and so on, is how the economics of all that work, and how do you fund whatever the situation is that allows you to provide all that digitally.
Well, and as I say, it's two infrastructures, you know, running in parallel. Even if you have a sound business model for the virtual side, and we know that the physical models in the past have been based on sound business models through the sponsoring and the things have been running. But having both is something that up till now has not been practiced. I mean, you really need to sit down with a spreadsheet and really work it out whether it's going to be okay or not.
Yeah. And you know, some of the numbers that you've quoted a number of numbers in terms of what, you know, pharma companies were paying to go to ASCO and so on. I mean, there's been a long argument over how much money they're required to stump up, and you know, are people going to really continue to stump up those sorts of numbers for these sorts of events? I think there's a couple of questions coming in here, which are touching on patients. Andrew and Richard's coming in. Andrew's Alan has talked about the Rare Disease Patients Conference going virtual, allowing a large audience to take part, which I think is a huge opportunity. We can all see that, whether it's patients or carers or just more doctors or more HCPs or more, whatever your audience is. It's just a question of whether they really do, whether they'll pay for it, and whether they'll be engaged, or whether they'll just sign up and go and do something else. But the question I thought I saw, sorry, I'm trying to find it, but it basically was a question coming in about accessibility. I just wondered whether you got any insight. So, you know, one of the problems you go to a conference, you know, people from all over the world, you know, it might be language problems, whatever. There might be sort of practical problems in me traveling somewhere to a conference. Well, virtually and digitally, it all opens up. And I just wondered whether you've seen any consideration of people who are attending a conference with multiple languages, or, you know, blind and deaf attendees is specifically mentioned by Anonymous here. Have you seen anything in terms of these platforms that are being used which address accessibility to that sort of degree?
No, I haven't. I mean, the only comments I've seen really have been those comments I mentioned before about time zone differences, and the fact that doctors from middle and low income countries do welcome more opportunity to attend virtual events, that's for sure.
Yeah.
There's one comment on the patient side. Everything that I've seen from patients, and I did interview some patients, they all love virtual events, you know, more opportunities to attend and the like. And I spoke to one patient advocate, Ronnie Allen, who's a neuroendocrine cancer patient opinion leader. And he said if you did a survey of patients, he said probably 99.9% of all patients will welcome it.
Yeah.
That's my end of one.
Yeah. And let's just pick up on this question from Andrew again. Do you think most societies could do a much better job of curating their events online to help delegates navigate? And specifically, he's talking about sort of using apps and about hashtags and not registering a hashtag and things. I know this is a bit of a thing of yours, is sort of hashtags, registering it properly, using them properly. Have you got any comments on how you're seeing people hopefully getting better at using that sort of media? I
think medical societies are going to be forced to get better. Otherwise, their members will get very upset. I mean, we've seen in the past, and my comment about the attributes of medical societies being conservative and slow and reactive. All of these things are really true. And Andrew's comments about not being able to use the appropriate hashtags, we find that up till today. But I'm sure this will be the event that coronavirus will force societies really to take virtual events and the whole of their digital presence much more seriously. I mean, it's inevitable.
Okay. And just so I suppose a fundamental question is, which you've sort of answered, I suppose, but just to answer the blunt question, do you see face-to-face meetings having a future?
Yeah, that's what everyone wants to know. I mean, if you listen to some doctors, and some are very outspoken on this, they say, of course we need physical events. We need the face-to-face interactions. We need those serendipitous opportunities to collaborate. It's impossible to do otherwise. What I don't really know is how many doctors are saying things like that. Is it really a very large percentage, or is it just a small number that like to go to these big events and they like to travel abroad and enjoy all the things that these physical conferences enjoy? And I must admit, I'm a bit of a hypocrite myself. I mean, I've been to many a conference in my time, and I do enjoy them. But I think their voice might be very loud, but I don't know whether it really is. I'd like to know the percentage who would say, yeah, it must be physical. And I make a difference there, and I think we have to make a difference between these large international events and local events where traveling is not such an issue, cost not an issue. They may well continue in some form or another.
Because people are people and people like people sort of thing. So there's that element always, isn't there?
Yeah, they are, of course.
Just to finish, we'll wrap up in a minute or two. So maybe just to finish on something which in itself could turn into a big topic, I know. So this is just a sort of top line stuff. But I would say, and particularly within our business, sort of MedComms, pharma industry, medical society, events and all the rest of it, I would have said, if you went back a few months, I'd have said that the whole climate change, sustainability, environmental type arguments were starting to really come to the fore and was starting to have an effect on how people were planning things. And then COVID's kicked us a long way in a particular direction. So just out of interest, I mean, again, do you see that sort of environmental stuff really you think it's been put to put backwards, or do you think it's been given a lot more fuel now? And will that impact? Because again, it's one thing we're going to say, we're not too sure whether we're for health reasons, but the environmental stuff was certainly starting to make some decisions. Influence decisions as far as I could see, even just a few months ago.
Yeah, and it's funny you should say that, Peter, because in February I was halfway through producing a presentation and writing up a paper on climate change, in fact, and its impact on conferences. And as I said, I was halfway through it, and then coronavirus really kicked in, and I ditched it. But the simple answer is I do believe it will have an impact. And do you remember I showed you a slide of a LinkedIn, a Twitter poll, the very first Twitter poll, where guilty conscience because of climate change was on the list there of one of the positives of virtual conferencing. Climate change hasn't gone away, quite the opposite. And I do believe, again, if we're thinking about the millennials and the Generation Z doctors, they will be much more aware of their impact on climate change if they continue to attend international meetings. And I actually started to plugging numbers with with ASCO and with ESC, looking at how many hundreds of thousands of tons of CO2 were actually emitted by attendees, and you can do that quite easily. The numbers are staggering.
Yeah. Okay. On that note, because that is a huge topic, we haven't got time to go there. On that note, I'm going to draw a halt to this, Len, if I may. We've sort of reached our time. I think we've covered a lot of ground there, and we've there's a bunch of ideas that people could talk further about. But for today and for this session, I'd like to draw a line and say a huge thank you to you for what you've shared and the ideas you've stimulated. Basically, for those of you watching the video later on, this is one of a series that we've recorded for MedComms Forum in July 2020. So you'll find all the videos from the different sessions and much more at NetworkPharma TV or on the MedComms YouTube channel. So to those of you online, please hang around because we're going to keep going now with the next session. But for the moment, I'm going to say a big thank you to Len. I'm going to stop the recording. So if you could just give us a wave, Len, that would be great.
Okay, cheers.